All right, you're good to go.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so first of all, good evening to everybody who has joined us today. I see some new faces that I haven't seen before, so I'll just kind of briefly introduce what this is and who I am. So my name is Dan Kaufmann. I'm a research assistant professor at University of Utah Department of Neurology. And for those of you who this is their first time, I'm just going to say that we decided in the headache school that each and every fourth each and every fourth week of the month, the second meeting is going to be dedicated to skills and techniques. So we have in the headache school didactic lecture, and this usually this topic today and each and every time on the fourth week of the month is going to be about actually utilizing some information to develop some easily to use skills that everybody can actually just take the skills immediately after the end of the session and apply that to their lives. The last time that we met, we were working on negative emotions or unresourceful emotions, which was more the emotional or affective component. And today, we're actually going to be dealing with the negative self-talk or our inner critic, or the more cognitive aspect of working with the cognitive aspect. So this is something that is relevant to the people who are suffering from chronic pain, but chronic migraine as well. And what we're going to do today is that we're going to talk about this whole concept of negative self-talk. Why do we need that? What is that for? Why is that even something that we need to address? And then we're going, depending on time, we're going to do some very short but effective interventions that I hope would be helpful to everybody who are here to address and to deal with this with negative self-talk. So without further ado, I'll just share my screen. Do you see the tools and techniques and the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, great. So we can continue. All right. So the topic that we want to talk about today is negative self-talk and working with our inner critic, which again, as I mentioned, meshes together with what we've done last time, which is working with negative or unresourceful affect or emotions. And the first thing that I want to talk about is the whole cognitive behavioral perspective, because as we all know, people that are living with chronic migraine or chronic pain are also faced with all sorts of things that compromise different aspects of their lives. The fact that they need to deal with recurrent migraines and headache can cause demoralization and frustration. It's also getting people to be angry or depressed and having these thoughts of why is it happening? Why is it me? Is it ever going to go away? What am I going to do about it? All of those can lead to helplessness and hopelessness and so forth and so on. And what I want to say is that these are not just random things that we are just thinking in our minds. These are things that influence all of us as we go about our day. And this also influences how we deal with migraines or with chronic pain. And I also want to say that we're just not just random passive bystanders that are just operating randomly through life. Everything that happens to us, whatever that may be, causes us to interpret whatever that is and give it meaning. It's like I read somewhere that we are meaning-making machines, and we try to make the meaning based off all these stimuli that happens in our lives by using our cognitive abilities. But importantly, when we create these appraisals or our cognitive interpretations of reality, those are not just random. Those are the things that we create, and they could modulate and they could affect how we feel and the responses that we are going to make based on these interpretations. So when we behave in a certain way, it is influenced both by what is happening to us via the environment and based on the cognitive appraisals that we have created based on what has happened to us. And so if we want to actually address all of those maybe maladaptive behaviors, it is important to first of all go one step beforehand and actually address how people actually think about what is happening to them. And that includes, are there maybe maladaptive thinking? And of course, what we've done last time, working with the unresourceful emotions. So all of the things that we interpret and all of these schemas that we created cognitively about the things that are happening to us can influence on our behaviors and also can influence how we feel and what we do. But the good news is that we're not just passive participants. Even if we have maybe maladaptive way of thinking, we can change those maladaptive thinking and be active agents to produce better or more resourceful way of thinking about the things that happen to us. Now, why is that specifically important for chronic pain? Because it's, as we know, the way that we think or the schemas that we create based on everything that is happening to us can have a direct effect on how we experience our pain and how we respond to it, which is why in this presentation, we want to give tools to address specifically all of those different ways that they're happening inside our minds that might not be the most resourceful to us. And so when we look at negative self-talk or our inner critic, we have those things such as some of these examples shown here on the slides. When we have these repetitive things that going on in our mind, such as my pain will never go away, or life is hopeless, or I'm so alone in the world, or I'm a loser, I hate myself. All of those things that a lot of time we might not be aware of, but especially when we're aware of, it can have very much direct effect on how we feel and the responses that we're creating as a response to those ways of thinking. And what I want to say also is that some people think, well, it's just a thought, it's not a big deal. But the fact is that when we engage in negative self-talk, especially repetitively, it can have an influence on our physiology. It can cause us higher levels of stress. When we keep berating ourselves, it can cause lower levels of self-esteem. When we engage in thoughts that are unresourceful or bring us down or can cause hopelessness or helplessness, that could be linked to an increase in experiencing of depression. As I mentioned, greater feelings of helplessness and hopelessness, especially if we engage repetitively in those self-defeating thoughts. And of course, when we have all of that within ourselves, it's very hard for us to engage in a healthy relationship with others, whether it be significant other, kids, family, boss, and so forth and so on. So all of those things that we might be engaging repetitively can have an influence on ourselves, on how we feel, on how we react, and of course on our well-being in general. So the main message that I want everybody to get from this is that our thoughts, our beliefs, and the way we appraise or interpret everything that happens to us has a direct effect about the experience of pain and our ability to cope with the experience of pain that we have in our lives. And this is why we want to start giving tools to address those kind of thoughts that might not be the most beneficial to us. So I want to introduce now the concept of cognitive distortions, because when we deal or when we talk about negative self talk or inner critic, it's usually important to identify that somewhere we might want to be aware that there might be a cognitive distortion. What I mean by that, by cognitive distortion, is that it's a biased perspective that we are holding about reality, about ourselves, about others, and so forth and so on. But this biased perspective that might not be true, as I mentioned before, can have an effect on our physiology, can have an effect on how we feel, and of course, can have an effect on how we react. So by learning to identify those specific distortions that we might engage in, it would help us to get out of those cognitive distortions and maybe choose a more adaptive or more resourceful way of thinking. So what are some of these cognitive distortions? We're going to give examples right now. So the first cognitive distortion that I want to mention is generalization, when we generalize. And what I mean by that is that we're assuming a general rule from either one or very few occurrences. For example, when we use words like never or ever or all the time, no one, everyone, when we use absolutes to describe something, it usually is indicative of a generalization. So in life, it's very rare that we have 0 or 100%. We're usually in the middle. So whenever we generalize things by using these absolutes such as no one, everyone, and so forth, we might want to look at it as a possible cognitive distortion. An example to that, as I given in the slide, is I'm never well, no one likes me, everyone hates me, and so forth and so on. When we use those absolute, it might be a cognitive distortion that we want to be aware of. Another example of a cognitive distortion is called a mental filter. And what I mean by that is that we're filtering information, focusing on just some of the things that are occurring. Usually, it's when we are dwelling on the negative and completely ignoring anything else. And I'll give you an example. I had a friend, and she went to Europe to this trip with some group of friends, and everything was fine, and the trip was wonderful. And towards the end of the trip, they missed the train, or something happened. And one of the people in the group said, "Everything is ruined. This trip is ruined. It's just the trip is not good." Now, what she was doing is she was focusing on something that happened that wasn't pleasant, but that does not mean that the whole trip was ruined. They had really, really good things that happened up to this point. So mental filter is when we are putting a label on something usually towards the negative, when we're discounting anything else that might be different or positive. So that's an example of a mental filter. Another cognitive distortion I want to explain is jumping to conclusions. And we have two kinds of jumping to conclusion. One of them is mind reading. For example, she didn't say hello to me, she probably doesn't like me. You know, when we have these instances where we interpret or jump into some form of a conclusion based on something that happened, and we assume to already know what the other person is thinking. So and so, I saw them leave really, really fast. They're probably angry at me. Or this doctor, he didn't say hello to me. That it's probably that he feels that I'm too much for him, or so forth and so on. When we engage in mind reading, when we assume to know what the other person is thinking. Another example is fortune telling, and it might sound silly, but it's like we have this crystal ball and we know what the future would look like. For example, if I go to the doctor, he or she won't have anything useful for me, or I'll probably not do so and so. This is not going to help me anyway. Nothing has helped me up to this point. This won't help me either. It's like the first of all, the word nothing is, as we mentioned, is generalizing, but when we are basing what is going to happen based on what has already happened. So this is jumping to conclusions. Another example, which is very frequent, especially when I work with people with chronic pain disorders, is catastrophizing. When we're imagining the worst possible scenario that could happen, and usually that engages with the what if. I don't know if you had these experiences of what if this happens, and what if this happens, and this happened. It's like we're in a matter of seconds, we can reach from one thing to another to the worst possible scenario. And an example here on the screen is, what if this pain would never go away? What if I lose my job? What if I will not have any money to pay my mortgage? And if that's going to happen, I'll be homeless. And if I'll be homeless, then I won't have anything to eat. And if I won't have anything to eat, I will so forth and so on. All this catastrophizing from one little thing or one thing that happened and going all the way to the worst possible scenario. So that's another example of cognitive distortion. Labeling. Labeling is usually when we're putting some form of a label either on ourselves or on someone else. And it's usually the label is usually negative. For example, such and such happened. I am so irresponsible. I'm such a loser. I'm so, and especially when we give some form of a title. And the problem with that is that the whole individual becomes that title. And we're missing that there might be other aspects to us or to that person. This is where labeling can be problematic because all we are is evaluating according to the title, usually when the title is negative, like she's stupid or he is careless and so forth and so on. When we always give those labels, we might want to look at it as possible cognitive distortions. Personalization and blame, which is kind of my favorite based on my upbringing. But when we are either taking things too personal or blaming either ourselves or the other person on things that might not be in their controls, and usually there are things that are out of someone's control. For example, if someone told you it is your fault that I have a high blood pressure, or vice versa, if we're blaming ourselves on someone else. So and so, she's sad. It's probably my fault, or I probably done something to hurt so and so on. And usually, these personalization and blame usually are distorted because we don't have any superpowers that we can actually influence other people's blood pressure physiology or emotional makeover. And it's usually when we take over responsibility on occurrence like that is what makes it a cognitive distortion. Should statements is some things that are really easy to identify, and we wanted to identify whenever we're using these should, shouldn't, must, have to's, either on ourselves or on other people, we might want to look at it as a possible cognitive distortion. And usually when we're engaged in criticism of ourselves or other people by putting some form of a should, they should do this or they should do that, or they have to, or I have to do something, that usually puts a lot of pressure and it might not be correct. And this is why this is a possible cognitive distortion. So this is, for example, a list of cognitive distortions that we might be engaged in when we go around the day or when we interpret things that happen to us. So what I would like us to do now is, again, I just want you to take a look at those cognitive distortion. It doesn't mean that you have to memorize it, but it's nice to know that all of those exists out there so that you'll be able to identify when you're engaging in those cognitive distortions. So I just want to go really briefly and have a little short exercises to kind of get you into identifying when is it that you all are engaging in cognitive distortions. And what I would ask people to do is I'm going to give a sentence and I'm giving you kind of like a couple of seconds. Look at the sentence and tell me, is it a cognitive distortion, and what kind of a cognitive distortion do you think this is? And you can either type it or just unmute yourself and say it out loud. And the sentence number one is, no one loves me. So first, is that a cognitive distortion, and what kind? Does anybody have an idea? Let's see. Generalization. Beautiful. Excellent. So yes, no one loves me is a generalization. Fantastic. Now, let's move to the next one. I can't believe I just did that. I'm so stupid. Is that a cognitive distortion, and what kind? What does people think? You can either type it or unmute yourself and say it out loud. I'm so stupid. What is that? It's like putting a label on, right? So that's labeling, especially when we're engaging in all these, putting negative labels, stupid, incompetent, and so forth and so on. I know what she thinks. She thinks I'm just faking it, especially a lot of people that go to the doctor with a migraine, and sometimes they think that some of the medical personnel might be thinking that they're faking it. What do you think that is? I know what she thinks. She thinks I'm just faking it. Mind reading. Excellent. That is a mind reading. Fantastic. Great. I have a migraine disorder. What do you all think? Is that a cognitive distortion or not? I have a migraine disorder. What do people think? So actually, yeah, wonderful. I have a migraine disorder is not a negative self-talk. Not everything that we think about is actually a negative self-talk. We need to differentiate from fact to the negative self-talk. I have a migraine, it's a fact. I have something that is called a migraine. However, if I would have said, I have a migraine disorder, I will never be, I don't know, or I'm such a loser, or whatever that means, that other part of the sentence is a cognitive distortion. Good. What do you all think? I will never get better. Life is hopeless. What do you think that is? I will never get better. Wonderful. Fortune telling, fantastic. And also we have a bit of generalization here. Never, never. Fantastic. Fortune telling, excellent. Like some of you have mentioned, said. I don't have anybody in my life. What do you all think? Anybody? No one. I have no one in my life.
It's kind of a generalization, isn't it?
Yes, fabulous. That's a generalization. Fantastic. I can't go with them again because of my migraine. They will probably stop caring about me soon. What do we think? What part is the cognitive distortion and what part is not. Fortune telling, wonderful. Now, I also want you to look at the sentence because the first part, I can't go with them again because of my migraine. That might be true. It might be that I had a migraine before, I'm having a migraine now, and now I can't go with them. So that part is an actual fact. However, they will probably stop caring about me soon. No, I don't have a crystal ball and I don't know what's going to happen. So it is as it was written here by in the chat, it is fortune telling. Wonderful. I can't believe I'm unable to complete that task. I should do better than that. What do people think? Is that a cognitive distortion? What kind? I should do better than that. I really should do better than that. I have to do better than that. Okay, this is a should statement. Also, I want to introduce you to the fact that usually when people say something like that, I should do better than that, there is also an implied labeling in it. So usually when we say, oh, you know what, I just can't believe that I haven't been able to complete the task. I really should do better than that. I'm such a, and usually we need to listen carefully what is going on because there might be some hidden labeling inside there, but it's a should statement. I'm not a good mom. I hear that a lot in my private practice. What do you all think? Is that a cognitive distortion or what kind? I'm not a good mom. I'm not a good person. I'm not a good dad. I'm not a good friend. I'm not a labeling. Wonderful. Excellent. It's not necessarily generalization because we're not saying everything all the time, but we are putting a label. I am not a good something. So that's very, very true. And the last thing, I feel so bad today. It's my spouse, sister, brother's fault. When we put blame, which I actually gave the answer, when we put personalization and blame, I feel so bad today. It's their fault, or it's her fault, or it's our fault, or so forth and so on. It's either my fault or someone else's when it might not be part of their ability. I feel bad because I feel bad. It not necessarily has anything to do with someone else. So again, another cognitive distortion, which is personalization and blame. So this is just kind of a little exercise to get you start to think about how is it that people can have these thoughts in their minds and maybe see if any of those things you might have it yourself. But now that we looked at cognitive distortions, the question is, okay, let's assume that I know that I have a cognitive distortion, but what can I do about it? So how do we overcome or negate some of these cognitive distortion? So when we hear a generalization like no one, everyone, all the time, we can work with that if we find even one example that counters that generalization. For example, if I think something like, no one loves me or no one cares about me, it's going and asking, is it really no one? No one, not even my dog, my kids, my spouse, my friends, my neighbor, someone. Even if we find one example, that negates generalization because it's no longer everyone or all the time. It's usually when we find one example, it negates this distortion. So when I say no one or all the time I feel bad. Okay, is it really all the time? Even in the party last week, even when I wake up in the morning, even when someone brings me dinner or so forth and so on. It's really finding even one example that negates that kind of way of thinking that is helpful to work with the cognitive distortion. Mental filter, as we mentioned, when we only look at some part of the experience. And so we want to look at other parts, specifically look at the positive. For example, my life is hopeless. can we find even one thing that is good or even mildly pleasing? Meaning, especially when we work with these thoughts that we keep looking at only the negative, when we start even deliberately finding these little teeny tiny things that are might be even mildly pleasing, and from one thing we can find another and another, and lo and behold, we can find many, many more things. So the statement, my life is hopeless, is no longer accurate because we found all of these other stuff that are actually pleasing. Mind reading, we want to look for evidence when we say, she probably hates me, or she probably thinks, or he probably thinks so and so about me. We want to ask, how do we know? What is the evidence for it? Now, it could be that so and so told me, I hate you. Okay, if that's the case, then that is actual evidence. But if she didn't, or he didn't, or if I'm just jumping into conclusions by mind reading, I want to know, what is the evidence for that statement? Is there an actual evidence, or is it my interpretation? Can there be another interpretation to what I'm thinking? Excuse me. Fortune telling. When we find fortune telling is when we foresee the future in a specific way, usually a negative way. And we want to find alternative options that can equally occur. It's also related to catastrophizing in a minute. But for example, my doctor probably has nothing to say to me. How do we know? Is it possible that I might be surprised? Is it possible that there might be new things that are coming, or so forth and so on? Can there be a different outcome to this way of thinking? And with catastrophizing, which is again, it's also kind of fortune telling, but with catastrophizing, we really go all the way down to the worst possible outcome. And what we want to do is we want to stop the train of thought. We want to find possible alternative consequences. Remember, with catastrophizing, we have, sorry, with catastrophizing, we have this chain of A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. It's like, oh, I was late today to work. My boss didn't like it. I'm going to get fired. If I'm going to get fired, I won't have enough money to pay my mortgage, and I'll lose my house. I'll be homeless, and da 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 da. So all of this chain of A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. Can we find other possible alternative consequences? Can A lead to something else? For example, I was late today, and it's probably that my boss didn't like it. Can it be that I was late today and my boss didn't care less about it? Or maybe he really didn't like the fact that I was late, but is it necessarily that I'm going to get fired? Can there be like maybe a warning of some sort? Or always find some form of alternative consequences in somewhere around the chain, which usually helps stops catastrophizing. Just finding a different thing that might happen equally as equally as obvious. With labeling, it's important to find a counterexample. Remember that when we put a label, it's like this whole person is one label, usually us. So I am so irresponsible. So it's like Dan, everything that Dan is just irresponsible. So can we find a counterexample? Can I find some example in my life that I was responsible? When was it that I was responsible? Is it really that every time, all the time, I'm irresponsible? As I mentioned, usually life doesn't work with 100% or 0%. Blame, when we put blame at ourselves or another person, it's my fault that she feels bad, or it's your fault that I feel bad, or so forth and so on. We want to question this cause and effect. It's like there is something that happened and so caused it, usually other people, or we caused something in someone else. And we really want to question who is really responsible. And we want to ask for specific evidence and find counterexamples that when I did X, it did not cause Y. For example, if I said something and so was offended, and it's like it's my fault that she was offended, can it be that when I said similar things to someone else or to that person, she or he wasn't offended? So it might be just something specific instead of putting a blame that it might not be true, that it's our fault that something like that happened. So in his example here, it's my fault that she feels bad. Is it really my responsibility? How specifically what I done has caused her to feel bad? Is each and every time when I'm doing X, I'm causing Y? Might not be. So this is something that is important to identify when we put blame on ourselves or someone else. Should statement, we want to question the statement and we want to know what would happen if such and such didn't happen. So for example, I have to do this task, or I should do this task, or else. What would really happen if I didn't? Are there any no other options? Is it either that I have to do this task, and if I'm not doing it, then whatever happens is like crucial? Maybe not. So all these should statements, we want to kind of expand our model of the world and look what other options can occur. So these are examples of how to negate cognitive distortions. Now, what we want to do is, now that we had this kind of introduction, we want to give two short exercises into helping people how to work with negative self-talk. But just generally, the way that we work with negative self-talk is in this following bullet points. When we work with negative self-talk, the first thing that we want to do is identify. And how do we identify? We can either hear ourselves or have this identify this thought inside ourselves that we recognize that it's a negative self-talk because we feel bad when we listen to this thought. Or sometimes we can just go around the day and we didn't really catch ourselves in the act, but we started the day fine, and all of a sudden we feel bad. It's like something happened. When these things happen, usually we want to go back and maybe revisit whether there might be something we were thinking that might cause us to feel bad about something. So identification is really important, because unless we can really catch the negative self-talk and actually do something with it, like we're going to learn, it might not be possible to actually feel better. We want to identify that first. Once we identify, it's very common that we're going to say, oh, you know what, I don't want to think that thought, just go away, or like maybe close our ears and say la 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 la, or something like that. In this model, I'm inviting you to do something different, is to actually identify the thought and observe it. Don't push it away. Don't say, no, it doesn't exist, I'm not thinking about it. Actually sit with the thought. Just really sit with it. Another thing that is actually helpful is to reframe it. Instead of like saying, oh, this thought and thought occurred, it's say, I have a thought inside me that says so and so. Okay, it's like all of a sudden I can dissociate and look at the thought for what it is, a thought, and reframe it and actually look at the thought for what it is. So we want to sit and observe the thought. And when we observe, we can actually have a little bit of distance from it. Once we observe, we want to evaluate. We want to see what is that thought about, and we want to kind of record that thought carefully. We want to identify, when we repeat that thought in our minds, how exactly is it that we hear the thought? Is there a specific volume to that inner thought? If there's like an inner critic, do we hear it in a specific way, in a specific volume, specific pitch, and so forth and so on? Also, we want to identify what is the content, what is the thought about, and especially after what we've done, what is the cognitive distortion? What is the cognitive distortion of that thought? Once we've evaluated that, we can modify it in the two practices we're going to do right now. And once we're going to do the two practices, we want to test whether that had an effect on the thought and on how we feel. Now, it could be that we've modified the thought, but we're still not feeling good enough. So we need to revisit that thought again, observe, evaluate, and maybe modify it in a different way, as we're going to do in a minute. This is kind of a general scheme of how I would recommend working with a negative self-talk. Again, first identify, sit with it, don't push it away. Sit with a negative self-talk, observe it, and maybe instead of saying I am doing so and so, just take a distance from it and identify this thought. I have a thought inside me that says so and so. Evaluate it and modify it in those two ways that we're going to practice right now. Okay. So I want to stop the sharing, and Chris, we can also stop